Hello, everyone. Welcome to Cave of the Cross Apologetics. I am Patrick.
And I'm Tony.
But hopefully you're continuing on, especially if you're a presuppositionalist, with our book, John Frame's Apologetics, A Justification for Christian Belief, because he's been a little bit critical on Van Tillian or Bonsonian tag arguments. And so you might not be a fan of his now, or maybe you've taken to heart some of the things that he said and thrown off the shackles of presuppositionalism and put on your hats for the ontological view. And so hopefully he's made his case to you. We've commented on a little bit and probably have our own ideas, but we're walking through this book. And now we're on chapter 5, where he doesn't really throw out tag, but uses it as kind of a precursor to talk about kind of the theistic arguments that he would use. And it's interesting because the very first part of chapter 5, where he talks about having apologetics as proof, theistic arguments, he kind of caveats a lot with what it does and what it doesn't do and what he thinks it might be done well, but also he kind of hedges his bets quite a bit here at the very start.
Yeah. Now, and also what we'll see here is he kind of intermingles tag with the other kind of traditional theistic arguments, which is kind of an interesting take on how tag could work, right?
Right.
And that'll be what we see as well.
Right. And so, he's definitely a person that doesn't believe that we should just allow people to have their autonomous reasoning, that the scriptures should be enacted in the type of belief system that we're a part of. And one of those is that mankind is not autonomous and that everything falls under the subjugation of God and his law and command. And so here he's going to kind of apply it and cover some of the things that, as a classical apologetic person, you may be familiar with, and it may have a slightly different ring to it. But also, if you're a presuppositionalist, this will feed into kind of what you know well as well. And so hopefully this will kind of add more tools in your quiver to pull out when needed. And so here he's going to kind of walk through 3 different ones. And for probably this and the next episode, we'll cover his kind of main thrust of what he thinks is the best proof, and then finish up with covering the other 2. So he starts out by saying that he will now present an example of a way to prove God's existence, taking into account the preceding introductory points of tag and the previous chapters that have come before. It will be rather different from the ways to God described in the preceding sections. In a way, it will resemble the most traditional of sorts of apologetics, yet the ultimate conclusion is quite Van Tillian. Nothing is intelligible unless God exists. So that's kind of the first basis that presuppositionalists point to. And so what Frame is saying is that he, just because he's critical of some of Van Til's points, he views kind of that framework as the literal framework that he's going to present these type of arguments with.
Yeah, good. And he says that, this argument will not be appropriate for every witnessing situation. Of course, no argument is, he acknowledges, because apologetics, and this is a point that he made earlier, is person variable. Right? So what may be persuasive to one person may not be persuasive for another person. Nonetheless, he tells us many educated adults from traditional Western culture should be able to follow, the main thrust and appreciate its logical force of the argument that he's going to put together. He says these people obviously are the ones that he's most used to dealing with. He's a professor and he teaches in a seminary, right? And so those are the folks that he's considering. He says this argument is not absolutely certain, right? So, many readers, he says, will find a problem in that particular thing that he doesn't get, that absolute certainty. It's not a proof per se, right? I think is what he's getting at here. Mm-hmm. Yet it should have some persuasive value, granting that persuasiveness he's already mentioned is very difficult to measure in apologetics.
Right.
So
right.
That's what he's after.
So he's not saying that you can just plug into humanity, these facts, and we'll run through the premise, and once the conclusion is set forth, we come to it and we ding out a card from our mouths and say, yes, I must now believe that. In fact, there's a point that he's going to get later in the chapter that actually deals with that quite a bit, and I was really impressed with that portion of it. But it's also to say, the persuasiveness aspect to it is something that apologists tend to get harped on, especially as a presuppositionalist, by saying, presuppositionalism, that might be fine and everything, but it doesn't persuade anybody, so it's not useful. And he's saying, let's take the best of that persuasive element that is useful and factor it in with these theistic arguments that he presents here.
Right. And so while he doesn't, show absolutely that, God exists and that sort of thing, in terms of, he does still call this a proof, right? He still says that it is a proof. It's just not what we would generally think of.
Right. So he says this proof should help the reader to see in what sense the evidence for God is obvious. Romans 1:20 tells us that God's existence is clearly perceived in creation, but alas, we are so often look and fail to see it. And, the presuppositionalist knows Romans 1 well, and so should the Christian, because it's a way for us to say, well, how come then people don't just look up to the stars and see? And sin plays a big factor into that, and it plays a big factor into that story. And we looked at that, especially with Scott Christensen's book that we did a couple books ago. So this argument should also help us to see how all intelligibility and meaning, and indeed all predication, depends on God. And he says that he intends to show that such predication depends on moral values, and that those in turn depend on God. And this proof has, therefore, the force of tag, though it is formulated in positive rather than negative forms for the most part. And we covered that positive and negative as well. And there's actually a short clip on our YouTube and also caveofthecross.com, where if you're wanting to familiarize yourself with what he said, you can check out just that portion. But he says that he will be arguing, in effect, moral values, therefore God. So there, he's done it.
So that's the basic thrust of his argument. Now, the first thing he does is he kind of clears the way here for, the general type of objection that perhaps an agnostic would say, right? That, we can't know, or I don't know. So he says, he starts off, and this is a section on atheism and agnosticism. And he says that our values determine our beliefs in the same way that they determine our behavior, right? There are many who claim to be neither theists nor atheists, he says, but agnostics. Excuse me. And he says that they claim that they do not know whether or not God exists. Of course, Scripture denies that, anyone can be agnostic, right? Again, Romans 1, we see that. So in one sense, he says everyone is a theist, for everyone knows God. But in another sense, unbelievers are atheists, for they seek to erase or to deny this knowledge, and thus to live on atheistic presuppositions. And he says, in this model, no one is an agnostic, right? Because Scripture say God has revealed himself to everyone.
Mm-hmm. Right. And so he kind of furthers this point by saying there's no agnosticism by the scriptural behavior test. If someone were genuinely agnostic, he would be frantically trying to find ways of hedging bets, at least giving lip service to God, who after all might one day judge him. And so you don't see agnostics or self-proclaimed agnostics saying, well, this week I don't know one way or the other, so I'm going to act in such a way that God is real. They're just kind of holding down the fort until someone presents them kind of persuasive proof in their minds. But we don't see them taking the opposite approach. It's always on a negative belief. There's no positive belief that would put them ultimately on the fence. They're just kind of giving lip service to saying, well, I'm willing to be persuaded, but ultimately you're not persuaded. Therefore, there are no agnostics. But as a matter
of when I read this, I immediately thought of Pascal's wager, right? When he says it's hedging your bets, right? Pascal says, hey, if we don't know, if there's no good evidence one way or another, then we should hedge our bets and act as if God exists, because that's the best bet, right? Because if he does exist, then we're good to go, says Pascal, right? We're safe. If he doesn't exist, it doesn't matter. And so that's kind of, I think, what he's getting at here, right? The agnostic, if he was really agnostic, we'd see it in their behavior. I don't know if God exists, but just in case he does, I'm going to hedge my bet and, act as if he does. And, and of course, the point he's making is that the agnostic doesn't do this.
Right. Well, he says, as a matter of fact, most professing agnostics do not hedge their bets in that way. Rather, they totally ignore God's word in their decision making. They never go to church, never seek God's will, never pray. In other words, they never behave exactly like atheists, not as if they were in some way some halfway position between atheism and theism. They always act as atheists until presented. They might be more open to listening. They might give more credence to, the idea of Christian thought has persuaded in a positive direction. The undertakings of the last 2,000 years of history, and so they might see some value, but as far as a positive belief, it's not there. It's always a negative belief until such time as their minds will be changed.
Right. And so this is what he's getting at by the behavior test, the scriptural behavior test, right? You can say what you think all the time, in all types of situations. But let's look at how your behavior is, right? If you say you're agnostic, he's suggesting there should be a certain kind of behavior. There's hedging bet arguments, we might say, right? But he says we don't see that with agnostics. They act exactly the way atheists act, right? And so what he says then is and we should always remember that there is no halfway house between, being God's friend and being his enemy. And he quotes several scriptures to help back this up. Joshua 24:15, choose this day whom you will serve, right? Matthew 6:24, no one can serve two masters, Jesus said. Matthew 12:30, whoever is not with me is against me. And so he says that the argument that follows is directed toward atheists and even those agnostics who give lip service to agnosticism, but live as atheists. And so he says, really, that kind of belies the claim of being an agnostic. Your behavior does, right? And so it says there's really only two, right? The believer and the atheist. And so his aim then with this argument is at the atheists, whether they call themselves atheists or agnostic.
Right. All right. So we've removed all agnostics from the world. Thank you very much. All right. Well, here's his moral argument. Here's where he gets into his what he would present as proof in a general overarching way on what he would, I think, value as the preeminent one that he would present. So the traditional theistic arguments have sometimes focused on causality, and sometimes on purpose and or design, and sometimes on ontology, that is the nature of being in general. More recently, various arguments that focus on moral values have emerged. He says that his argument is of the latter source, at least that is how it begins, is he's going to focus on this moral claim of moral values actually existing and finding out, therefore, what?
Right, exactly. So he calls this the moral argument. So he's going to give us a moral argument for the existence of God. And so he begins by kind of clearing the way here, and he's going to look at, how folks attempt to determine what morality is or the source of morality. He's going to give us several attempts at coming up with the source of morality, and he's going to try to show that those sources are wrong. And then he's going to show that obviously God is the source of morality. So that's, as you said earlier, morality, therefore God, right? That's what he's getting at. So he asks the question, what are moral values and how can we come to know them? He says some have argued that although right and wrong cannot be directly seen or heard, they do arise from experience. So here's the first kind of source of morality?
Mhm.
Comes from our experience of the world, right?
Right.
Well, he's, David Hume, he tells us, so this is, David Hume was, wrote in the 1700s, a Scottish philosopher, extremely influential, as we probably know, in the history of ideas and in philosophy. Hume points out that X brings good consequences, though, and this is the point that Hume makes here, does not logically imply that X is morally good. Just because, something is the case, is what we're going to see here, doesn't mean that it ought to be the case. Or just because something brings about good consequences, does not logically imply that is morally good. Statements about facts, he says, and cannot entail any conclusions about morality. Valueless facts do not imply values. Does not imply ought. So this is Hume's famous, is ought fallacy, right?
Right.
That values, you can't get an ought from an is. Just because something is the case doesn't tell us anything about what ought to be the case, right? So this is the is ought fallacy that Hume made famous, actually, in his discussion with regard to morality. And so is our experience of the world, the facts in the world, is that the source of morality? Well, he's suggesting that Hume is saying, no, that's not. We can't get morality from facts in the world. We can't get an ought from an is. That's the issue that he brings up. So experience doesn't seem like it's the source of morality.
Right. If I take a baseball and I throw it at a brick wall of a store and it bounces and catches it, well, that's a lot of fun. I move over the glass pane and realize, if I throw it at this glass window, it won't bounce to me as well. In fact, it'll go through the window. Oh, that's a thing that happens. But should I be doing it? That's where the experience of that glass breaking or potential glass breaking doesn't tell me if I should even be throwing the ball at something that's not my property. And so we're unable to get that. Don't throw the ball at the glass because it's not yours is morally good. And so
in other words, we can see that if we throw the ball, it'll break the glass. Mm-hmm. We can experience that, but we don't experience the wrongness of it. Right? We don't really experience that. Right. So all we can see is the activity of the ball being thrown and the glass being broken. And of course, we know that the glass isn't mine, and so, but we don't see the wrongness of it. We don't see the evil in it. We don't see, how that is immoral some kind of way. Right. And that's basically the kind of thing that Hume is getting at. Right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's no facts. Yeah. There's no I'm doing an experiment ability before the court where you got to pay it back. All right. So some would say that these values are merely individual subjective feelings, right? I think that's probably what, if you brought up this type of argument with other people before, you maybe less now. The postmodernists, what's good for me is good for me. What doesn't always mean that it's true for everybody. But also you might be saying, well, you're just as subjective as well with your ideas. And so, we all stand on our subjective feelings of ickiness or of it feeling wrong, but we can't say that it is wrong. It just feels that way subjectively. And he says that on this view, we can call the thief's action of a bank robber evil or wrong because I am emotionally repulsed by robbery.
Yeah, so there it is. Yeah. So it's not in. So now what he's suggesting here is that if the fact doesn't automatically get us to a value statement, mm-hmm. maybe the reason why we believe it's wrong is because of our subjective emotional feelings. That's what he's getting at. So this is another, we might say, cause of morality or source of morality, our subjective feelings.
Right. Every time I walk into a bank with a gun out and a bag, the bag magically fills up with cash, and I'm richer. Therefore, it's good because I walk out with something that I didn't have before, right? I mean, that's it. We can't say that it's wrong because that's just your subjective feeling. And so what do we do with that? Well, okay, it's easy enough to describe other people's ethical standards as subjective or emotional, but kind of few of us would, if any, would be willing to describe our own standard that way. Whatever does the most amount of good for the most amount of people, that's what we should do. Well, except that you don't view your standard as only the squishiness that you would say, someone else would say, well, whatever makes me the most happiness is what we should pursue. And I don't care about anyone else, but whatever makes me happy, selfishly is what is morally good. And so I should do that. Well, no, yours is wrong, but mine is right. But we wouldn't say, well, both of us have different standards then. And we just kind of shrug our shoulders and, go on our way. And then the other person robs you because you've got something that they want and it makes them happy to have it and for you not to have it. Well, he says our evaluation of robbery is not just our own subjective taste, though. It is a judgment that we are obliged to make and that we believe everyone else is also obliged to make. Just because I don't like it doesn't mean that, well, okay, I stick my hands in my pocket. I wish that person would have the same value statements as I. No, we hold people accountable. In fact, when we were talking about Mitch Stokes's How to Be an Atheist, we critiqued Sam Harris on a similar fashion for if there's no such thing as free choice, if everything is harshly determinative, what's the point of having court? Well, we do it because it's good for society. Well, what does that matter if all things are determined and it doesn't matter what we say is ethically good or ethically not good, and we have things that we label as crimes that cause people to maybe reconsider their ideas if all things are just determinative. And here, if all things are just subjective taste, why are we holding people accountable for that in a greater society if all things are subjective? Well, then it's just might makes right. And so we can then turn robbery into a good thing if we have more votes than the person that put forth the ideas that robbery is wrong. So what do we do?
Right. Yeah. Good. So, and that gets us to his kind of third source for morality. So far we've seen the question is, what's the source of morality? And the first answer was, well, maybe it's because of the facts, our experience, the facts that we experience in the world. He says, no, you can't get values from facts, right? That goes against what Hume has suggested is the fact value fallacy. Okay, well, then maybe it's comes from our own subjective feelings. Maybe it's how I feel. That's what the source of morality is. And he says, no. I mean, everybody admits that, it goes further than that, than just what I feel, my own subjective, emotional feelings. Robbery is bad, period, right? Regardless of what I feel. Okay, well, then thirdly, it's possible that moral values then are not, individual subjective feelings, not merely the subjective feelings of one person, but perhaps the shared feelings, right, in a given culture. And so culture or society passes down from one generation to the next what's morally right or wrong. So maybe the culture or the society is the source of morality.
Right.
Well, again, he says, as a matter of fact, we don't generally regard moral values as mere cultural taste, right? When we hear of cannibalism, for instance, in a far-off tribe, he says, our response isn't, well, I guess that's, what their morality is all about, right? I guess that's their particular taste. Right? No, we don't say that. We say that is wicked, regardless of what their culture or society says, right? Mm-hmm. So, notice our subjective experience doesn't get us to morality, nor does our just the facts in the world, nor is it handed down by cultures. Cultures do not determine morality. So he's kind of clearing the weeds away here and meeting all of these attempted sources of morality so that we can get to what he's after.
Right. So as a matter of fact, we act and think as if these values were objective rather than merely subjective. So where does that come from? Where is that sourced in? If we deny objective values, we should be aware of the price we must pay. For denying objective values is something far more drastic than merely denying conventional or parochial or standards of behavior. It's to deny rationality itself.
Right, exactly. And so where's he going with this? Well, he says this: what is truth, right, after all? And he says it is many things, obviously, but among them, it is certainly an ethical value. So truth is an ethical value. The truth is what we ought to believe and what we ought to speak with one another. And so these oughts are oughts of ethical value.
Right. Right. So even if we did something like peer review, this is the point that I usually make is, okay, you could have all the peer review literature in the world, but if no one's able to reproduce it with true statements like, oh, I reproduced this experiment and I found the same thing. Well, if you didn't do that, that doesn't add to the truth of the statement. That just makes you a liar. And once found out, it doesn't advance the argument whatsoever. It just bolsters this idea that, well, peer review is the highest form of knowledge. And the idea behind that is more, there's an objective standard out there, and it's beholden upon all of us to interact with it in the same way. And then we should communicate that truthful outcome to other people. And so that's where the peer review aspect comes from it. And so to tell the truth, or to say, I did this and I believe that you're wrong in the way that you did this experiment, and I got this conclusion. There's where the ethical part of it comes in. Even talking to one another, we base it on ethical standards. I come up to you and I say, I disagree with what you did at work, and so now I'm going to punch you. Well, that's an unethical standard, because that doesn't talk to the facts of the case. It's only I'm able to hit you, and that has nothing to do with whether it was right or wrong. So the ethical value of even talking to one another is formulated even here.
Yeah, right. So we have to have some type of objective standard. In fact, he says the assertion that ethical values are merely subjective is self-contradictory, like all statements of subjectivism or skepticism. He says, for the subjectivist is telling us that we have an objective moral obligation to agree with subjectivism. See the problem there? The subjectivist is telling us that we have an objective moral obligation to agree with subjectivism, while also telling us that no one has an objective moral obligation to do anything. Right. Well, you can't have it both ways, right? Either we have an objective obligation, therefore subjectivism is wrong, or we don't have an objective obligation, and therefore I don't care what your subjectivism says. I have one too, right?
Yeah. So my subjectivism is that all of us have to have one agreed upon objective value system, and so we go from there.
That's right. Which is self-defeating, by the way.
Which is self-defeating. Okay, fine. All right. We didn't solve world peace at the end. All right. Well, okay. But before we consider the origin of moral values, let us note one more point. Ethical values are hierarchical, and they're structured that way. We should seek to make our children feel good is one ethical value, right? It's something that I think we all can agree on. We want our children to feel good, to be happy, to have what's best. But for most of us, it is a secondary value to we should seek to teach our children self-discipline. One of those ways is, well, yeah, my children would love to have their iPads and play Roblox 24/7, but at some point they're going to have to learn math in order to figure out how much Roblox accounts for real money. And actually, probably the value of Roblox is way better than even what the dollar is at the taping of this episode. But at any single moment, there is one principle that takes precedence over all the others. One that prevails over all the others is governing our behavior. And we can see that by just walking through, okay, well, when come upon, if you're a doctor, do no harm. Well, I found a person who's laying out in the street, and I can save them by cutting them open and removing this thing. I don't have their permission. Well, I should always have their permission, except this one thing could save their life for them to sue me. So at what point do we get up the rung of the ladder to say, here's our single most important hierarchical peak of ethical behavior. Well, that highest value is not only objective, but also absolute, for it takes precedence over all others and serves as a criterion for the truth of others.
All right. So notice what he's done here. He says, okay, let's consider moral values. He says they're hierarchical, right? So some take precedent over others. They're higher than others. They're more important than others.
Right.
They should be, exercised over others. But now, where do we stop? Well, he says there is a stopping point, right? There is a highest value that we kind of take that is over all the rest of the values, right? And so the next question then is, well, where does the authority of the absolute moral principle, the highest one, where does that authority come from?
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so
I think we can look at this, especially as Americans, is where do we find the most ideas stem from for things like rebellion against the Stamp Act or the Boston Tea Party? Well, it wasn't just rooted in the fact of taxation, which in and of itself is immoral and illegal, but also it was written about in terms of freedom and liberty, and that's what caused more people to write points and counterpoints if depending on if you were for the rebellion or for staying as a loyalist. So you have the idea of, well, no taxation without representation, but the king is ultimately the one in authority and we don't go against him, therefore don't rebel. But then you have people who are writing about, Lockean type ideas of liberty and freedom. And then from there say, and thus the king can't just do away with what should ultimately reside in the power of the governors. And therefore this is immoral because of that. And so you have that type of hierarchy, even in kind of what us as Americans kind of view. And it's the ones we always go back to and read more and more, even though, yes, we should read about how 7 cents for a stamp increase is immoral, even if the king doesn't.
Right. So notice he's getting at the source of morality, and he says there's this hierarchy, right? Some are higher than others. But there's always one that's absolutely authoritative over all the rest of them. And so he says, what's the source of that? And he kind of cautions us that he's not asking whether the conviction itself, right, that this one is higher than the rest of them. He's not asking for the source of that. It's the source of that conviction as if it were a causal argument. The question, he says, concerns the authority of that principle. Why should I give it the enormous respect that indeed we do give it? That is the highest, principle that we use to judge all the rest of the things that we do. And he says, well, ultimately, there's only two kinds of answers that are possible. The source of absolute morality and moral authority is either personal or impersonal. Mm-hmm. That's what he says. So that's basically ultimately those are the two answers that we can come up with. Either the sources of absolute morality and moral authority is personal or it's impersonal.
All right. Well, and so here's where we'll end part one of Frame's kind of justification for using the moral argument. And so when we come back, we'll kind of unpack the two avenues that someone can take, and from there we'll get deeper into his understanding of what the morality, therefore God, argument is. So you can always go back and throughout the week we post short clips with cool AI art behind them. I've been working with that, so if you noticed a different transition to images, you're welcome. I've been messing around with them, so figure might as well use them for good rather than evil, which is an ethical decision that I made. So thanks for joining us. Continue to share, like, comment, subscribe, all those good things, and then share it around, tell other people. We appreciate those of you who download every Monday or Tuesday. It depends on who wins out, depending on what you're doing. So I see those, and we appreciate you opening up these books along with us and figuring out apologetic study with us. So thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
See you next time.